Okay, welcome everybody. Tonight is Tuesday night, and you are watching the video notes on the cell theory and the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. The objectives for this section, you can see are listed here, nothing that you have to memorize or take notes on. Here's where we start. Okay. The cell theory is composed of three parts, and there are several scientists that contributed to the cell theory. And those are the key scientists that are listed here. Yes, you should know who they are and how they contributed to the discovery of the cell. You do not have to memorize dates or countries or any of that such. Okay. All right. So, who basically first looked and designed the first microscope? Well, that dates all the way back to 1590, and like I said, you don't have to memorize dates, but that was a long, long time ago. And that was the Jensen brothers. Okay, they were Dutch in origin. Again, that's not a fact that you have to memorize, but they basically built the first microscope. Then it was not till a century later when Robert Hooke came along. He was English, and he is known as the father of the microscope. Okay, or microscopy. And that is probably a fact that you should know, that Robert Hooke is known as the father of microscopy. And he is the English father of microscopy. And he is famous because he coined the term cell. When he looked under the microscope at some cork cells, and this you should also know, he took the bark off of a cork tree and looked at the cork underneath the microscope. And when he looked at it, it reminded him of how the cells were that the monks lived in the monasteries. That's why he called it a cell. And that's where that name came from. Then we have, another famous scientist came along a little bit later. His name is Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He was Dutch in origin. And you can see they were fairly close in time to each other, which is why he is also known as the father of microscopy. He is believed to, because he is made famous because he first looked at pond scum, basically. He took pond water and put it underneath the microscope and saw living, moving things in the water. So there you have it. That's what he brings to the table as far as discovering cells. He found single cellular organisms. Then you go on, and the next three are key in the actual the cell theory. Schleiden. He was the first scientist to document looking at plant cells underneath the microscope and the parts of the cell. And then Schwann, also a German, was famous for looking at animal cells underneath the microscope. And then Virchow, also German, he came up with the discovery that cells came from other cells. Okay, so they come from pre-existing cells. And that whole cell division concept is what's going to come out of his discoveries, which we will look at in a later unit. All right, what are the components of the cell theory? Well, there are three parts, and you'll need to know all three of these parts. First of all, that all living things are composed of at least one cell. So a single-celled organism is going to have at least one cell, and then you have multicellular organisms, which have many cells. So there's at least one cell. If it's a living organism, it has at least one cell. The second piece is that the cell is the most basic unit of life. And then the third part is that cells come from other cells, which is what Virchow discovered. Next slide then talks about the difference between unicellular and multicellular, and I already know that you know what these words mean just because you know what prefixes are. So unicellular, uni being the prefix that means one, multicellular, multi meaning many. Yep, you guessed it. Unicellular organisms are only composed of one cell, and multicellular organisms are composed of two or more. Okay, so that is the difference between multicellular and unicellular. Bacteria would be unicellular. We would be multicellular because bacteria obviously are just a single-celled organism, and we have trillions of cells, so we are multicellular organisms. All right, what contributes to cell diversity? Well, basically there are three factors that are going to define what the diversity of a cell is. One is the size, how big the cell is and how big it's able to get based on its surface area to volume ratio. The other is the shape of the cell, and that plays a key part in what function they perform. For instance, muscle cells are very long, oblong. They're very oblong cells, and it kind of makes sense because if you think about it, a muscle cell has to be able to extend and contract, and in that stretching process, you'd think of fibers that are kind of long and drawn out, like how you stretch taffy or something like that. So it makes sense that they've got that long oblong shape. And then, of course, what internal structures do they have? What organelles do they have is going to be able to dictate what kind of functions they can perform as well. Okay, the last piece of it is comparing prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells. Real fast, I'm just going to reveal these, and you should get these down and know these components. Prokaryotic cell, that is the most primitive cell. So I put the P's and the P's together. Prokaryote's primitive, and if you remembered it's the most primitive cell, then some of these things will make sense. For instance, it's very small. Okay, in comparison to eukaryotic cells, it's going to be very small. Eukaryotic cells are either going to be single cellular or multicellular, like us. Okay, prokaryotic cells then are you going to be one cell and one cell only. Okay, so single-celled, unicellular. Prokaryotic cells are not going to have the DNA bound in a nucleus. The DNA floats freely, and I think I pointed this out on the video to you on the organelle video. The DNA just floats free within the cell. It's not bound by the nucleus like they are in eukaryotic cells. There's no organelles. That's not entirely true. I mean, it does have some organelles, but it's very basic. Okay, at the very basic of organelles, like ribosomes. Okay, that would be a very basic one, so that it can do protein synthesis. And an example would be bacteria. Okay, eukaryotic cells definitely have their DNA bound and contained within a nucleus, behind a nuclear membrane. Definitely have organelles, and that ranges from all the 19 that I showed you, so a lot more organelles there. And examples would be plant cells and animal cells. Now, a lot of people make the mistake and think that prokaryotic cells are plant cells and eukaryotic cells are animal cells. That is completely false, not true, not true. Don't be the one who makes that mistake. Prokaryotic cells are very primitive, and those are bacteria cells. Eukaryotic cells are very advanced, and that would be your plant and your animal cell. The last slide in this series then is just a picture to show the comparison. The one thing this doesn't really show is the size difference, because to me they look pretty proportional, but don't be still into that. They are definitely different sizes. All right, so that's all I have for you on these slide notes. So take your notes, and anything that you handwrite you can use on the quiz tomorrow. So I will see you in Wednesday on class. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye.